organized by the Permanent Observer Mission of the Sovereign Order of Malta on the occasion of the annual European Anti-Trafficking Day. I am particularly grateful to the ambassadors of the European Union and of Austria, which currently holds the presidency of the European Union, for their participation, as well as to the representatives of Italy, the Council of Europe, and IOM. We also look forward to hearing the contributions of the panelists and, of course, to the interventions from the floor, all of which will no doubt ensure a rich and inspiring discussion. Now, some people will probably ask themselves, why is it the Order of Malta that is organizing an event on European Anti-Trafficking Day? We do have our headquarters in Rome, so we can modestly qualify. But the main reason is that through our worldwide humanitarian activities, we witness daily the devastating effects trafficking in persons have on the lives of those we assist, refugees, migrants, and displaced persons fleeing conflict and persecution. As global displacement rises, this terrible blight is increasing in scope and dimension, thereby achieving unprecedented levels of sophistication. Wherever possible, we seek to advance our efforts against human trafficking through social services and humanitarian action conducted by our national association and our international relief agency, Malteser International, as well as through our diplomatic network. In order to strengthen our commitment in preventing the trafficking in persons and protecting the victims, the Order of Malta appointed last year 2 new ambassadors to tackle this plague. Based in Geneva and in Lagos, Professor Michel Veuthey, who is here at my right, at your left, our mission's deputy permanent observer, is now also the Order's ambassador to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, while our colleague Romain de Villeneuve was appointed ambassador at large in Africa. Michel has taken on this additional mandate with his usual enthusiasm, initiatives, and dedication. Thank you, Michel. Their task is to raise the awareness of humanitarian institutions, strengthen relations with international stakeholders, as well as support the implementation of the United Nations Protocol on the Prevention, Suppression, and Prosecution of Human Trafficking. Today's event is held in this framework and spirit, as is the Order of Malta's engagement in promoting dialogue on humanitarian topics in Libya with local institutions and international delegations. In a series of meetings attended by the representatives of the European Union, UNHCR, IOM, and the UN Support Mission in Libya, plans for concrete action were developed, resulting in capacity building for local authorities to stop human trafficking and reduce deaths at sea through search and rescue at sea training courses for Libyan Coast Guard personnel. In parallel to these diplomatic efforts, the Order of Malta is also intensifying its action with projects at the local level that focus on protection, prevention, and human rights. In the Mediterranean Sea, its Italian Relief Corps, which is embarked on Italian Coast Guard vessels, has been at the forefront of rescue efforts, assisting hundreds of thousands of persons. In concluding this brief introduction, allow me to quote from a statement issued on 30th July 2018 by our Minister for Foreign Affairs on the World Day Against Human Trafficking, and I quote, "On the World Day Against Human Trafficking, the Sovereign Order of Malta appeals to governments and civil society, including business, to take measures to prevent and end human trafficking while protecting and assisting victims and survivors. Human trafficking is a tragic form of contemporary slavery, which constitutes a crime and a serious threat to human dignity and physical integrity. The Order of Malta would like to underline the need to enhance synergies, partnerships, and alliances among different United Nations agencies, regional organizations, international and local non-governmental organizations and civil society, including faith-based organizations. These measures are desperately needed to prevent violations, protect victims, prosecute those responsible, share research and experiences, highlight good practices, raise awareness and engage proactively with regional and sub-regional organizations. End of quote. Allow me now to call on His Excellency Ambassador Walter Stevens, Head of the European Union Delegation to the United Nations in Geneva, to report on the European Union's ongoing efforts in its important contribution to combat trafficking in persons. Excellency, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. And let me thank the organizers of Malta, but also the permanent mission of the Holy See and the Council of Europe for organizing this debate and having invited me. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to be sharing here some of the opening remarks. We've had such distinguished colleagues who are probably much more knowledgeable than I am, like our colleague from Austria, Ambassador Tichy-Fisslberger, who has been the national rapporteur of Austria on the trafficking of human beings, and of course also Laura Thompson and all the others, Laura Thompson, Deputy Director General of IOM. As you know, I mean, the EU Anti-Trafficking Day was established in 2007, following a recommendation by the European Parliament and on a proposal by the European Commission. Ever since, the 18th of October is marked with events across the European Union, bringing together all relevant actors working for eradication of trafficking in human beings. Last week it was in New York, today it's here in Geneva and in Brussels. So we mark this very important day. Why did the European Union take such an initiative? Because trafficking in human beings is a violation of fundamental rights, explicitly prohibited under the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. It is also listed as a crime in Article 83 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. And I'm proud to say that the European Union has established a comprehensive and also forward-looking legal and political framework that is based on international standards, anchored in human rights, is also gender-specific, child-sensitive, placing the victims at its heart. Addressing all forms of trafficking in human beings is a priority for the European Union and its member states. And we took action with numerous projects since early 2000. We have legislation, it's called the EU Anti-Trafficking Directive, was adopted in 2011. And it's characterized by a victim-centered approach and also having a gender perspective. And we have also a policy strategy with concrete and practical measures. All is being coordinated by the mandate of what is the EU Anti-Trafficking Coordinator. Trafficking in human beings is indeed a highly profitable form of transnational organizational crime, organized crime. It's based on the exploitation of victims that are very vulnerable. And the profits of these activities are sometimes huge. And there is indeed a complex relationship between what is supply and demand. And that must be addressed if we want to really address this crime effectively. So we have to look at how we can disrupt the business model of trafficking in human beings, and it will depend on addressing this effectively, but also on improving the victim's access to rights. And to that end, we need to both inside the European Union, but also outside the European Union, take action and provide a coordinated and consistent response. Outside the European Union, we continue also that cooperation in addressing trafficking in human beings through regional dialogues, processes that are called the Khartoum process and the Rabat process, with countries along the eastern and the western migratory routes and the central Mediterranean routes, but also in Africa and elsewhere. The fight against trafficking in human beings is also included as a priority domain in the joint Valletta Action Plan. And we have an EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa, which addresses or tries to address the root causes of irregular migration, with projects to create local job opportunities, as well as the fight against traffickers and smugglers. We also deliver technical assistance to local law enforcement and police authorities in order to address the issue. And of course, I think you mentioned it already, our mission, UNAFOR Med Operation Sophia in the Mediterranean, has as a mandate also to combat trafficking and smuggling networks, but also, I mean, it's not in the mandate, but also saving lives, which is of course the first task. We work together with our international partners to assist them in the fight against traffickers and to promote international legal standards, as enshrined in the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and its protocol on trafficking in human beings. It is important, I think, to ensure that our efforts and the language that we use reflect these international standards. We, as the European Union, will be tirelessly engaging in multilateral processes, ensuring that trafficking in human beings is addressed. Be it also in the context of the negotiations of the Global Compact on Migration and on refugees, but also in the framework of the work on the Agenda 2030 and Sustainable Development Goals. And I would like to remind that the Sustainable Development Goals number 5, number 8, and number 16 indeed includes a reference to the trafficking of human beings. Human trafficking is further addressed also in the dialogues that we have with countries in South and Southeast Asia, like the ASEAN, but also the ASEAN. And we work closely together with the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, with which we have a 4-year initiative running that is called the Global Action to Prevent and Address Trafficking in Persons and the Smuggling of Migrants. It assists 13 strategically selected countries in enhancing capacities and developing and implementing comprehensive and national counter-trafficking and counter-smuggling responses. In short, Madam Ambassador, I think this is a very important issue for us, and we will spare no effort to address it. Of course, we will do this in cooperation with others, because I think we can only address it in a joint effort, meaning also a multilateral framework of cooperation and in a multilateral approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. I think the role of the European Union is extremely important. You underline that clearly. When you say apart from business models of the traffickers, I think that is obviously a huge task, because we all know that international criminal networks are very powerful, and that it's difficult just for one regional organization to fight them in an effective way. And you mentioned ASEAN and many other regional organizations with whom you cooperate, and that is also a key to success in the long run. Thank you very much. I now call on Her Excellency Ambassador Elisabeth Tichy-Fisslberger, Permanent Representative of Austria to the United Nations, and also, as I mentioned before, in the Presidency of the European Union at the moment. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. To the Order of Malta and all the other organizers, as Ambassador Stevens mentioned, I was for a few years the Austrian coordinator against human trafficking. I used to organize with my staff such EU anti-human trafficking days. It was a lot of work, and I'm very glad this year to be participating in an event because so wonderfully organized by colleagues. The EU anti-trafficking day is supposed to be particularly, above all, awareness-raising day. So let me tell you a story which happened in my country, because human trafficking happens everywhere. UK police uncovered a gang of child traffickers. They found £180,000, which had been earned by 160 children in 1 month. So there was police cooperation all across the continent. Somehow they ended up with their investigations in Romania and searched 17 palatial villas in Romania, built by these traffickers. The children had disappeared in the meantime. They were just trying to find money or whatever. One of the children who disappeared there ended up in my country, in Austria, in Vienna, and was taken up by a shelter for children and started to tell her story. And the story was she was 14. She was forced to beg. If she didn't bring enough money during the week, she was forced into prostitution over the weekend. She had up to 14 clients each weekend, and she got 150 euros per weekend. She was told that was a good price. We suppose that each and every one of these clients had to pay at least that sum. Now, this girl wasn't aware that this was human trafficking and that she was the victim of a crime. And when she was told by people who took care of her that this was a crime in Austria and people needed to be punished and that in fact the money was very little, what she said was, but why is that little money? My father is a bricklayer in Romania and he gains 80 euros per month. So this story already shows a lot of what we talk about. It shows that, first of all, victims are extremely vulnerable. We are talking about extreme differences between countries, and we also see that we can only uncover such stories if there is massive international cooperation, which work rather well in that case. Human trafficking happens everywhere. We have figures from various international organizations, and I'm sure we will hear more about this later on, but all these figures are estimates. We know that this is the tip of the iceberg. It's a huge growth ground. It's the third most lucrative form of international crime after drug trafficking and arms trafficking, and it is the least risky for the perpetrators. There's almost total impunity. Perpetrators are middle income. It's not only a crime, as Ambassador Stevens said, it's also a way of undermining democratic societies, regular economy, as well as development perspectives in the poorer countries. What are the reasons? The reasons are all the upheavals we witness all over our globe at the moment. First of all, extreme poverty, having to do with wars, having to do with disasters, both humanitarian and ecological. All kinds of deficiencies in various states, bad governance, corruption, a lack of a legal system, a judiciary system, and perpetrators who use all this for a free ride, who are completely unscrupulous and very creative. The bad situations in some countries really is like an advertisement for people smugglers and also for traffickers. And they offer simple solutions. For people who want to get away, they say, no problem, we organize your trip, you pay later. And this paying later means that the person will be exploited once arrived at destination. The forms of human trafficking are to 80% sexual exploitation. So there we talk about a vast majority of female victims, women and girls. It comes in all kinds of variations. It's forced prostitution, but also child marriages and fake adoptions and other things. The special UN rapporteur on human trafficking, Maria-Thérèse Giamarinaro, who recently gave a speech in New York, she said there is a 600% increase of Nigerian women being trafficked into Europe into prostitution over the last 3 years, in spite of all the efforts international communities undertake. Then we have various forms of labor exploitation. They all have in common that it's badly paid jobs, which do not require a lot of qualifications, which take place in places which are invisible, which have a high fluctuation of staff, seasonal work and other things. And you find that in sewing, you find it in cleaning, you find it in catering, in hotels, in care for the elderly, domestic work, including in diplomatic households. That's an interesting topic. My ministry has developed a zero tolerance policy in these cases, and there is a project inside the OSCE which has been going on for various years, where protocol departments of foreign ministries work together in order to prevent such situations if possible. Then there is the construction sector, which can be dangerous because it works with a lot of subcontracting. So you have a very respectable architect and his company who gives the tender, who win the tender, but then you have all these subcontractors whose job is to treat the workers very badly in order to make big business benefit from these low wages. Recruitment agencies can be very dangerous. You find everything from modeling agencies to marrying agencies to agencies who send you posted workers cross-border, and there's a lot of risk potential in that as well. Mining is dangerous, agriculture is, processing of agricultural goods as well. And then there are the cases which I mentioned briefly earlier on, those who force mostly children into begging, and also sometimes into pickpocketing, petty crime. Internet is a major new source of danger, in particular for the recruitment. On the internet, and in particular on the darknet, you find everything from mail order brides to organ trafficking. Another sad chapter is child trafficking. Child trafficking is very easy for the perpetrators because children don't know where to flee. They always come back to the perpetrators because they don't know where else to go. Outside Europe, you find even worse forms of human trafficking, like hostage-taking, child soldiers, organ trafficking. If you travel to India, you might find that many in India or somewhere else in the region, that many people owning a rickshaw have a scar on their back, and that shows that they probably paid their rickshaw with a kidney. And then we have terrorists, who force women into marriages with warriors and do everything up until organ trafficking. The victims always have one thing in common: they are very poor, they are so poor and so desperate that the only thing they can monetize is their own body, and they are prepared to do that because they think their situation cannot get any better, and also because people make them believe that what they propose to them is a real offer, and they are not educated enough to tell the false promise from a real offer. They are very vulnerable, usually from the most discriminated parts of their own societies, sometimes very young, mostly very uneducated, sometimes belonging to minorities, sometimes being disabled, very often vulnerable because they're women. And they are additionally vulnerable because they don't have usually a residency status in the countries where they're being exploited, and sometimes they have multiple dependencies. They were brought by the trafficker to the place of destination. They have to pay back their travel and their accommodation, and probably they have contracted debts at home which they need to pay. So this is really a picture of a tragic situation which is hard to talk in terms of human tragedy. Legal instruments have been mentioned. We have at the international level the most important one, the so-called Palais Protocol, to prevent, suppress and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. We have the Council of Europe Convention, which I'm sure Ambassador Filipovic will talk about later on, so I have to say nothing about that, and they do have the most detailed instrument, which is the EU directive mentioned by Ambassador Stephen. These days we talk a lot also, we hear a lot about modern slavery. Some people prefer that term. It's not a legal term which you can find in any of these instruments. It's probably easier to make the general public understand what it is. The problem about this terminology of modern slavery as opposed to human trafficking is, and that was another thing which the EU Special Representative Maria Grazia Giamarinaro said, it hides the fact, if you say modern slavery, it somehow hides the fact that 80% are female. So that's one of the problems, but there is a debate about that. Now, what to do? There is no one-size-fits-all easy answer. There has to be a mix of smart policies. That's what the international organizations and the international community are trying to do. We have all these wonderful laws. It is very hard to implement them. The biggest enabler for the perpetrators usually is false tolerance. People who see something or who suspect something but don't quite dare to look, who turn a blind eye because very often they don't know to do what the victims if they have identified themselves. The jargon in all the international organizations is that you should work on the so-called 4 Ps. Ps for prevention of the crime, protection of the victims, prosecution of the perpetrators, and partnership, working together with others to avoid all this. What we are doing now is an exercise of prevention. We are trying to attract the attention of more people to what is going on. Another way of preventing, and that's also something which happens at the international level, is trying together to train certain categories of professionals like for example police, but also prosecutors, teachers, health workers, consular staff, all kinds of professions who get in touch with potential victims. There is also an effort in many countries to inform victims. NGOs do that. We have seen this morning, there was a Swiss event, I don't know whether some of you went, equally attracting attention to human trafficking. They have a bus which goes around and tries to inform victims of the dangers. And of course what we all need to do is try to fight the root causes, but that is a lot easier said than done. In terms of protecting victims, that really is the touchstone of all the international regulations that we have. That's the most important thing, because we're talking about human rights violation. Now the first challenge is to identify victims as such. Very often they don't go to the police, they're afraid to be deported or otherwise punished. So you have to identify them otherwise. Once they are identified as such, they have a set of rights. In most countries, they have rights to financial and material support, like shelter and food. They have a right to medical and psychological assistance. Ideally, countries should have what they call a national referral mechanism, so kind of guidelines for different authorities in every country to know exactly what to do with the victim if you detect one. Then in many countries the judiciary has special provisions for victims of human trafficking and also for witnesses, because you can imagine if there is a court case they don't necessarily want to meet the perpetrators in court. And then other rules in the European Union, for example, say that the victims have a right of access to the labour market in the country where they are, and they have a right to compensation. Prosecution is difficult, as I said earlier on. It's the least dangerous crime, big organized crime for perpetrators. They're hardly ever caught. Police talk about lizard ends. What they mean is that if the perpetrators get caught, they're immediately replaced by somebody else, and as everybody knows, the lizard's ends, if they get cut off, they grow back, so there will always be enough of the perpetrators. And usually it is extremely difficult to prove what happened, because they are mutually agreed exploitative relationships. So the victim has agreed not to say anything, because the victim is being threatened and other things. What is very important, I tried to mention that earlier on, is international police cooperation. In Europe we have Europol. Europol has adopted a policy of following the money, and that has turned out to be the most efficient way of seeing what is going on. Both nationally and internationally there has to be a cooperation between different authorities. So we have police, we have the judiciary, we have border controls, we have labor inspectorates, we have health authorities, social securities, trade unions, and very importantly NGOs, both national and international. Usually what we see is that the state is there to legalize, to produce the law and try to implement it, but the persons that the victims have confidence with are usually the representatives of NGOs. So in that field, at least in my country and in other countries I know, there is a very good cooperation between the authorities and the NGOs who provide the actual assistance for which they get money, financial assistance from the state. So I said earlier on, it takes a smart mix. This is the real difficulty. We are dealing with perpetrators who treat human beings like a commodity. It's big business. There are the incentives for that big business. So what we really need to do is to undermine that business model, which is very difficult, and what it takes is not only authorities and laws, but really to work together with society at large, with consumers, to make consumers realize that part of the problem are supply chains. If products are very cheap, that is fishy, and consumers should think about it, and it is important to look at the money flows. I think I've already spoken too long. I could speak forever because I dealt with it for many years, but let me just say this as a final remark. There is a vicious circle. Human trafficking is very lucrative. the money which is being earned is being reinvested in other kinds of crime, like arms or drugs or whatever, and with that they make even more money with which they improve the infrastructure for human trafficking. So this is extremely hard to break. It is a very difficult task for the international community, but I think all of us who are in this room would agree there's nothing else we can do but try our best to put a stop to that.
Thank you very much, Excellency. I think this was a very complete picture of what is going on in this field. A very sad and tragic picture, of course, but we have to confront these realities. And in addition to the legal instruments that the European Union and European countries have already taken, I also remind you of the Global Action Plan, the Global Plan of Action to Combat Trafficking in Persons, which was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 2010, as well as several General Assembly resolutions since. So in spite of all that, I think the work is on the ground actually, and that is where we have to, every one of us can probably contribute. I now have the great pleasure of inviting His Excellency Ambassador Ernesto Massimo Bellelli, Deputy Permanent Representative of Italy, to take the floor. Italy, as you all know, is in the forefront of this problem, and we look forward to hearing your remarks, Ambassador, on how your country is dealing with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, your colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start thanking Ambassador Michel Veuthey for the engagement in this matter and the Sovereign Order of Malta. This is a timely event. It's a matter that, as was explained, is of the greatest concern. And it's a subject of which we know only the front of the iceberg, as Ambassador Tichy-Fisslberger. Exploitation of vulnerable people for financial gain by organized crime is a shame for the whole humankind. It's a gross violation of human rights and a challenge for the international community. The fight against human trafficking is for Italy a priority, both at national and international level, including in the UN framework. Italy believes it is necessary to promote with determination international law enforcement and judicial cooperation to fight against this matter, and we are engaged in different levels. At the same time, it is very important to protect victims, paying particular attention to those in a situation of vulnerability, such as women, children, and accompanied minors. Unfortunately, and we have seen in most cases, this is the most difficult point to face, because combating trafficking maybe sometimes can have results, but providing a parallel protection to people in a situation of vulnerability, this is much more difficult. I would like to bring here the experience that Italy has in the matter, and but calling for an international engagement on the matter. We can deal on the matter only if we are all together. Italy, of course, supports the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking Persons. We have received visits from the Rapporteur. We invite to have the same also in the other countries, because sometimes we discover and we disclose things that we are not aware of. At the international level, I would like to recall that Italy is engaged to promote and protect human rights in multilateral fora, such as in the case of the OSCE, which Italy is currently holding the chair. That framework, the promotion and protection of human rights, is one of the 3 priorities of the Italian presidency. And as far as human trafficking is concerned, many activities have been carried out. In this framework, we are especially proud of the project to combat human trafficking on the road of migration, which was aimed at enhancing the ability of arresting the participating states and partners to engage. Together with other countries, with the involvement of Italy, Switzerland, Austria, Andorra, Hungary, Germany, France, and the UNHCR, the project aimed to reinforce cooperation to effectively investigate and prosecute human trafficking and to promptly identify victims of trafficking in human beings. On the routes, and the different routes by sea and by land, promoting a multi-agency and human rights-based approach. The engagement of Italy and the Mediterranean was mentioned. Of the 300,000 people that were rescued and saved from the Mediterranean in the last 4 years, we have seen, unfortunately, many were victims of trafficking. Italy fights against human trafficking also at the national level with attention and with the most effort. In this respect, I just would like to mention the Italian National Action Plan Against Trafficking and Serious Exploitation of Human Beings, adopted in 2016. Such a plan identifies multi-annual strategies of intervention to prevent and fight against this phenomenon, and it promotes measures aimed at increasing public awareness, social prevention, and social integration of victims. In addition, just to provide you with a further example, Italy has a very strong legislation to combat undeclared work and labor exploitation in agriculture. This is another way of trafficking. Several varieties were mentioned, but this is an additional one. People that are modern slaves that are employed in the agricultural sector, and that sometimes we discover inside countries that we consider advanced countries in the social sector. So this is why we think that it's important to look not only to other countries but also inside our countries. With that in mind, I just express our full support to the European Anti-Trafficking Day and wish the best success to the work of today and to the plan.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. As I mentioned, the Order of Malta and Italy are in very close cooperation on several fronts, in particular the Mediterranean, and we look forward to continuing this excellent cooperation. Thank you very much. May I now call on Her Excellency Ambassador Dragano Filofovic, Permanent Observer of the Council of Europe, who will speak to us on the efforts that the Council of Europe is engaged in to combat human trafficking. You have the floor, Excellency.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. First of all, let me say that I'm deeply honored to be here today among these distinguished speakers. I would like to thank you especially to the Permanent Mission of Sovereign Order of Malta and Michel Veuthey for this continuous initiative and devotion in addressing this issue, because this is not the first time that it's happening here in Geneva. As a representative of the Council of Europe, of course, I can say that my organization has been actively engaged in combating human trafficking in all of its member states and beyond. And this day, 18th October, as the European Anti-Trafficking Day, is actually an occasion to mobilize sources against this phenomenon of trafficking in human beings. Trafficking in human beings is happening as we speak right now in every continent of our world. It is a global phenomenon, transnational, transborder. It is happening in the war zones, but also in peaceful, stable, and democratic societies. The scale might be different, but it's the same crime. It is a slavery of modern age, the age of high achievements in science and economic development. It is not only a crime, but it is an affront to human dignity and a violation of the most fundamental human rights. And as such, it undermines the very values of the Council of Europe, other international organizations, and our societies are based. Traffickers target the most vulnerable people in our society is trapping them into a vicious circle of exploitation, abuse, debt, and shame. So let's see some statistics. According to the latest Global Slavery Index, it is estimated that there are more than 40 million people in conditions of modern slavery around the world, including almost 25 million people, victims of forced labor, and more than 50 million victims of forced marriage. 1 in 4 of them are children. Indeed, these are striking figures. While these figures should be interpreted cautiously, given the gaps and limitations of data, they depict a very disturbing picture, including of Europe, where it is estimated that some 3 million women, men, and children are victims of modern slavery. Many victims remain undetected. An issue that has emerged from different monitoring reports, that we will speak later on, is that the official statistics often fail to reflect the real scale of the problem. The Council of Europe commitment to combat human trafficking reached an important stage with the adoption of the Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings, which entered into the force on 1st February 2008. The Convention takes a victim-oriented perspective to anti-trafficking action and provides for a series of rights of victims of trafficking. It places positive obligations on states to prevent human trafficking, protect the human rights of victims, prosecute and punish traffickers, and engage in international cooperation, which is absolutely crucial in this matter. The Convention is currently applied by 47 countries in Europe, 46 member states of Council of Europe plus Belarus. Its implementation is followed by an effective independent monitoring body known as GRETA, which is actually a group of experts on action against trafficking in human beings, 15 of them. It's followed by them, and with targeted cooperation programs which are put in place to assist states to meet their obligations under the Convention. The main added value of this Convention is its human rights perspective and focus on victim protection. It defines trafficking in human beings as a violation of human rights and offense to the dignity and integrity of the human being. It provides for a series of rights for victims of trafficking, in particular the right to be identified as a victim, to be protected and assisted, to be given a recovery and reflection period of at least 30 days, to be granted a renewable resident permit, and to receive compensation for the damages suffered. This year, in May, the Council of Europe marked the 10th anniversary of the Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings, organizing a conference in Strasbourg. The conference examined the impact of the Anti-Trafficking Convention on state parties' law, policy and practice, and in particular improving the situation and rights of victims of trafficking. However, the challenge is to ensure proper follow-up of GRETA's findings and recommendations. In other words, we need to ensure impact. I would like to highlight a very important fact. GRETA's reports have brought to light a considerable gap between the number of identified victims of trafficking and the number of successful prosecutions and convictions. It means that we have to work more. There is absolutely no comfort zone for any government today. The Council of Europe Anti-Trafficking Convention contains provisions in the area of international cooperation, requiring parties to cooperate to the widest extent possible to prevent and combat trafficking in the human beings, to protect and provide assistance to victims. The global challenge requires the global cooperation. GRETA's monitoring of the Convention has lighted, unfortunately, certain difficulties in the areas of international cooperation. both when it comes to effective investigations in transitional cases, in transnational cases of human trafficking, and in the area of protection of the rights of victims in such cases. Which means that it is absolutely necessary to reinforce cooperation between countries of destination, countries of transit, and countries of origin by further developing police and judicial cooperation. Now, the most recent Greta annual report highlighted the particular challenges of trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation. Labor exploitation was chosen as one of the thematic focuses of the second evaluation period of the Convention because of the concern that Convention obligations were not being met and that many victims of labor trafficking were not being identified as such, nor granted access to assistance or protection. Greta has decided that the third evaluation round of the Convention, which will be launched later this year, will focus on trafficking victims' access to justice and effective remedies, which is essentially for victims' rehabilitation and restatement of rights. Let me add that the implementation of Greta's recommendation is linked to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals as well, in particular targets goal 5.2, 8.7, and 16.2, and are also relevant for the discussions on the Global Compact for Migration. Let me say that it is particularly powerful when the victim of human trafficking becomes a living symbol of the fight against trafficking. Of course, I'm referring to this year's laureate of Nobel Peace Prize, Ms. Nadia Murad, 25 years old, the Yazidi girl who was born in Iraq. And it goes also to Dr. Veuthey, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, who also devoted his life to treat women raped by an arms rebel in Congo. These two incredible individuals are both fighting to help victims. Nadia Murad, who after being held as a sex slave by the ISIL for months in the war zone, has created her own NGOs to help women and children victimized by genocide, mass atrocities, and human trafficking. And as I already said, Dr. Veuthey actually continues to help women victimized by rape. There is definitely a lesson learned for all of us here. I must stress how crucial it is to never lose sight that regardless of the form human trafficking may take, sexual exploitation, forced labor, organ removal, forced criminality, we are not only dealing with a serious criminal phenomenon, but also with a grave violation of human rights. In conclusion, let me say that it is our shared responsibility to combat human trafficking, whether we work for international organizations, governments, civil societies, or businesses. We need to work even more closely together in order to break the vicious circle of exploitation and to restore the human dignity of victims of trafficking. The Council of Europe has been and will continue to be actively engaged in combating human trafficking in its member states and beyond, in partnership with other international organizations and, very important, with civil society.
Thank you, Ernesto. I think you're underlining the importance of partnerships is extremely important. We all need to work together, that is obvious. But the Council of Europe obviously has a large network of partners and therefore can contribute immensely to this problem. Thank you very much indeed. May I now call on the Deputy Director of the International Organization for Migration, Her Excellency Ambassador Laura Thompson, to give us an overview of IOM's perspective on this. I know that the Global Compact on safe, orderly and regular migration has dealt with this problem as well, and we look forward to hearing your views on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you very much for the invitation for being here. I'm very pleased to share this panel with several friends, and some of which, like Elisabeth, we have been in panels about trafficking, I don't know for how many years now. So I think the good thing of being the last one speaking is that the majority of the things have been said. But one thing that I think it's very clear that the problem is a huge problem. And labor mobility is certainly one of the most prominent features of the 21st century. And this is going to continue. There are a lot of these labor migrants that move regularly and in perfect ways, and nobody abuses of them, but there are a serious number of people that are extremely abused and exploited through this process. And I think that's what we are talking about. We are talking about real people, and we are not talking about statistics, although we talk a lot about numbers. And the reality is that these are human lives that are destroyed every day through this process. So we mentioned a lot of figures now. I think one very important figure is that of these, we talk about 250 million international migrants today. Well, in the last, let's say, statistics that we have, we know that there are somewhere around 25 million people that are trapped into exploitation. And that's, imagine, 25 million lives destroyed and abused every single day. So this is the seriousness of what we're talking about. And these type of abuses occur everywhere. Several of the speakers talked about in different sectors, certainly agriculture, construction, clothing, everywhere. Certainly the sex industry is full of it. And it works in different supply levels of the supply chain. It works by the enterprises that do it, by the subcontractors, by the one that are subcontracted by the subcontractors. So it's extremely difficult to tackle. We cannot understand human trafficking and address it if we don't look, first of all, at migration issues, as second, huge and important demand of cheap labor. And these, we are all responsible because we all like nice, cheap products. And cheap products are only produced by cheap labor. So that, I think, is the first thing that each one of us, we have to be part of the solution. We have to adopt a hands-on, a global hands-on approach to this. So what have we done? Because we're not starting from scratch. And it's not because Elisabeth and I have been talking about this through the years that nothing has happened. First of all, we started looking at the issue of trafficking through a lens of the supply. So we, first of all, did a lot, and in the last 9 years that I have been particularly dealing with this issue, we have created legislation in a lot of places that have specific legislation for human trafficking now. We have trained, I don't know how many thousands of officials at governmental level, judges, prosecutors, custom officers, ministerial labor inspectors, diplomats. We have trained a lot of people, and this is an effort that is an effort of governments, it's an effort of, I would say, a large number of international organizations have been doing this. Civil society has been key in trying to address these issues. We have also created, systems of protection for the victims. Civil society has been key in that. We have done a lot of information campaigns about risk of irregular migration, risk of trafficking in persons. So all this has happened. 3 or 4 years ago, I was again with Elisabeth in another discussion about this, and I said, we have been so much focusing on the supply side of the human trafficking we have forgotten in a certain way the demand side. Why people are trafficked? Well, because there are interests of sexual exploitation and a lot of interest for cheap labor. And that cheap labor comes, and that sexual exploitation comes from individuals and private sector in the majority. So we are not talking eventually to the right people. We are talking to one side of the group, but we have forgotten to talk to the other one. And this, indeed, has happened in the last years. Many governments have or are in the way of developing new policies and new regulations that promote a greater accountability from the business sector. This is the other side. As a result of this, we have, I would say, increased the expectations that we will have of businesses to do a real and serious due diligence process in the way that they work. And these have to do a lot with the supply chain because, again, somebody mentioned before that there are cases where you go to a very nice architecture but the whole subcontractors in the process is where eventually those problems exist. So we have to really look at that and bring the business into this discussion more and more. And as you see, in the majority of the places that you go, business are not sitting in the table. And I think that's an important element. Civil society obviously continues to have an extremely important role, not only in the direct assistance of victims, but in addition into the whole advocacy role that they have about labor rights, about human rights, about everywhere around the world. So, indeed, human trafficking is a problem, a huge problem. It's a problem that exists everywhere. It doesn't matter if you have good social protection systems, if you have good legal frameworks. It doesn't matter. It exists in every single country, and every single country has to be part of it. At the global level, we have done very nice developments. I think, well, the Palermo protocol that was mentioned, the global plan of action that was mentioned. We have the SDGs that bring human trafficking as a center also, the global compact that we mentioned. So we have the framework. We have the legal framework. We have the reasons why to do it. What else do we need to do now? Well, I think as I said, we have to continue doing everything that we have done, and we have to bring more the private sector part. And there are some laws that have passed, and that's why more and more we're talking about the issue of modern slavery. And we can have long discussions about terminology, but the reality is that has helped, as Elisabeth said, for ordinary people to understand what we're talking about and touch, I would say, something that is much more deep inside each one of us. Also, I think each one of us, for us, is frightening to think that there is slavery happening in the 21st century. Human trafficking is a legal concept up to a certain point, and that brings a little bit of difference. So I think some specific suggestions for the way forward. Again, bringing the business, I think, is fundamental. We have been working with a lot of big companies in the last years to look at the supply chain, to help them to look deeper into that supply chain. So the first thing that I would say is, and Gravana, you mentioned it a little bit at the end of your presentation, we need to look at the next frontier that nobody has looked at, of the supply chain management in the response to victims of trafficking, or survivors, as we prefer to call them. And Elisabeth mentioned about the 4 Ps process, and I think the remediation part is one of the ones that nobody knows how to deal with it. And we have a lot of questions from companies coming to us and saying, okay, let's say now we know and we understand that we're responsible to look at our supply chain and ensure that the whole process of production is clean. But what happens if we find cases? What do we do? How do we deal with it? And this part is extremely important. Remediation of victims is not only a matter of justice or a matter of bringing them some economic help, but it's basically help them to come back to normal life, help them to become again a normal social person within the society, and make them feel that they have been compensated in a certain way for that wrong that they have received. This is certainly not an easy task, because very often the access to remedy is where the whole justice system fails. And I think that there is something that needs to be looked at and cannot be neglected anymore. We have to put that into our minds when we talk about collective actions and how to deal with this. I would say one good example that we have, and I think I can mention the name of the company. We have, in case I cannot mention the name of the company, it relates to a fruit. And we have been working with them, and we have developed some remediation guidelines in order for them to use them for victims of human trafficking that align with the UN guiding principles of business and human rights. And we are trying to make in these guidelines avenues, or to create avenues for businesses to protect and assist these victims of exploitation once they have identified the cases. A second element that we are looking at now is how to go even deeper into that supply chain for cheap labor, how to do it, and how to help companies to do it. We really need to bring a transformative change there to really be much more efficient in the way that we are countering trafficking in persons. We need to develop new ways of doing, innovative ways. We have to be able to map better what is happening in the supply chains, learn more about the path of migrants and see how it works in the supply chains of different companies in different sectors. So a lot more of analysis needs to be done there. We have been working with a lot of companies, some governments and some civil society organizations in trying to address these issues at the recruitment industry, and I think Elisabeth mentioned the recruitment part of it, that is extremely important. And we want to try to get globally rid of the employer's pay or impose the employer pays principle, the business model, because up to now a lot of the exploitation and abuse that happens is because employees, people that are looking for a job internationally, they have to pay a fee in order to get a job. And that fee makes them extremely vulnerable because those fees are huge and they spend a lot of years trying to pay even for that fee. So how can we get rid of that terrible way of recruiting people? And we have to work with people that are in the recruitment sector in order to be able to really come and understand better the movement of people between the moment that somebody decides to find a job somewhere else and the moment that that person gets there, all the people that are implied or implicated in that chain. Certainly more attention to due diligence is good. And we have at IOM, we launched last year a social compliance system called IRIS, the International Recruitment Integrity System, that we hope that is going to help private sector in doing these things. And finally, I think that we really need to talk more and encourage more the survivors to help us in the work. Ravana mentioned now this excellent example of Nadia Murad, and she is a survivor of trafficking. She got the Nobel Prize because of her commitment to help others. And I think that these type of examples is what make people realize that not only we there are things that are happening, but also that there are people that are totally committed to try to prevent it, even when they have had terrible experiences themselves. And this is, I think, extremely powerful for all of us. So let's continue that way, and I hope that the panel can find other possible solutions after this to get more concrete answers at the end of the day. Because, as I said, there are few areas in the world, I think, where there has been so much commitment and so much agreement between everyone that we have to fight. Human trafficking is one of those. And despite that, I have been in IOM 9 years, and I have to say that we still have the same numbers, and we still have failed to make a big change in the way that people are treated around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Thompson. IOM has played an extremely important role in this field, and we are very much encouraged by by what you've just told us, in the sense that you are making good headway. But as you said quite rightly, there is so much to be done that can only be done if we all work together. I would like to thank all the speakers of this first part of our discussion today for their extremely interesting and also very forward-looking reports of their different organizations and countries. And we will now move on to the panel discussion. We have some distinguished panelists who are experts in the field of human trafficking, and we look forward to hearing from them now. May I call on the Deputy Director, Division of Protection, Policy and Law, UNHCR, Mrs. Charlotte have I said it great? Excuse me, and please you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for treating UNHCR's specialists, and for really using this day so effectively to continue raising awareness going forward. We will just wait it. I think it's important to start by highlighting the great appreciation that Europe has been a leader in advancing human rights-based interventions centered on gender and child-sensitive services for victims, as well as playing a critical role in prosecuting perpetrators and engaging the private sector to fight forced labor in global supply chains, a lot of which we heard about from the previous speakers. And Europe has been actively doing this very much within the context of international efforts to prevent and respond to trafficking. So indeed, thanks to years and many years of dedicated effort, engaging with all sectors, a lot has been done. And indeed, I think our understanding of how, why, and where trafficking in persons manifests itself is steadily improving. And indeed, I think events such as today play a very important part to contribute to raising awareness on this critical issue. And I'd like to think that it actually touches on all the 4 Ps that we heard about from the ambassador earlier on. So really, thank you very much for bringing this all together around us today. From UNHCR's perspective, we have 3 mandated interests when we're engaging with persons for trafficking. Firstly, preventing asylum seekers, refugees, and stateless persons from becoming victims of human trafficking. and when they do become victims of human trafficking, to extend protection and solutions for these individuals. Secondly, identifying whether a victim of trafficking or a person who fears being trafficked may be eligible for international protection as a refugee. And this is an important area on which I'll expand on subsequently. And thirdly, assisting states in ensuring that trafficking victims who are without identity documents are able to establish their identity and nationality status in order to prevent them from being rendered stateless persons and to protect stateless victims from trafficking. We do this internally and alongside the international community to implement stronger protection measures for victims of trafficking, including through advocacy efforts to promote asylum-sensitive anti-trafficking legislation at national levels. We also do awareness-raising activities like the innovative Telling the Real Story campaign. Some of you might have heard about it, which uses refugee personal voices and videos to inform refugee populations, peer-to-peer, and other persons of concern about their experiences of exploitation and trafficking risks along certain routes. And we engage in efforts to identify victims of trafficking, including at reception facilities, within camps and in detention centers where we might have access, and ensuring that effective protection and solutions are found once we identify the individual citizens. But looking ahead and drawing on our most recent experiences, collective experiences, I think that we need to collectively maybe recognize that the unprecedented increases in the numbers of people traveling by sea and overland to Europe since 2014 has indeed altered the profile of victims of trafficking that we're seeing in Europe today. People on the move in Europe may have been subject to trafficking in their country of origin. And here we have circumstances, for example, of women subjected to sexual enslavement, such as by ISIL, and who might be relocated to countries in Europe for rehabilitation. We equally have victims who were subject to trafficking in transit, and unfortunately we've seen a lot of that from unaccompanied and separated children circumstances, forced into labor, and other forms of exploitation. And victims at destination as well. For example, women who are forced to repay their debts for the travel, finding themselves in debt bondage through commercial sexual exploitation as a form of paying back potentially smugglers or traffickers who brought them to where they are. These new issues have posed new challenges to our existing methods of categorizing and supporting people who may be in need of protection, and shedding light on where our collective anti-trafficking responses can further be strengthened. First among these challenges is to improve an understanding of the links between trafficking persons and refugee status. These links, they're very limited in terms of understanding these things. While not all victims of trafficking are refugees, it is important to appreciate that in some circumstances, victims of trafficking or people who fear being trafficked will qualify for refugee status under the 1951 Convention. I think it's important for states, asylum and migration responders, and anti-trafficking practitioners that they be fully informed of this nexus in order to aid accurate identification and protection of individuals. If responders only identify the person as an asylum seeker and not as a victim of trafficking, then I think collectively we miss the opportunity from a law enforcement and criminal justice angle to gather essential information about perpetrators, and in turn will deny the right of the victim to have an access to justice. At the same time, if we only identify the person as a victim of trafficking, we may deny them access to international protection, which in fact they might be, and to which in fact they might be entitled. Ensuring greater coordination between asylum and trafficking procedures will lead to more comprehensive protection and stronger anti-trafficking responses. This issue broadly also points to the importance of having greater conceptual clarity for humanitarians, for law enforcement, criminal justice practitioners, and victims. And the use of terminology to strengthen an understanding and coherence in anti-trafficking activities, and providing, importantly, victims with internationally agreed upon avenues for protection. We've heard issues previously around the conflation of modern slavery, perspectives, whether that term, as we heard, hides the fact that 80% in fact are women at being hurt. And while certainly we can appreciate that for the wide public it might resonate easier, I do think it is important to appreciate that that is not a legal term within trafficking in persons, and it may undermine, in fact, the application of state obligations arising from the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons. And that state obligation might get lost if we conflate legal terms with non-legal terms in terms of responses for the victims. The second challenge we are facing from our perspective is the need to actually have an honest and clear narrative with all the nuances when we're looking at victims of persons trafficked. We must be vigilant to ensure that our narrative accurately reflects what we're actually witnessing, particularly as a result of crises in mixed movements of refugees and migrants. Refugees and migrants being smuggled and trafficked often move along the same routes. Some of those who have been trafficked from their country of origin move along these routes under false beliefs about the nature of their journey, only to later be forced into sexual or labor exploitation. Others may consensually engage smugglers, but following their arrival, discover that their smuggler is imposing a condition of debt bondage, or sells them into forced labor or other forms of exploitation, and by doing so, effectively is trafficking. As such, although human smuggling does not involve the element of exploitation, it can become effectively trafficking, especially when migrants and refugees remain vulnerable upon arrival in their country of destination, thus at times blurring the distinction between these two crimes, for which we need to be conscious in order to protect the victim's account. Moreover, while there are very severe forms of exploitation and trafficking committed by highly organized criminal networks, there are also significant levels of trafficking at a lower scale, and again we heard about that earlier on today, such as forced marriages and forced begging. People who have left their homes, jobs, schools, and who have no source of income, no source of state protection or support, who do not have any legal authorization to access employment in the host country where they arrive, and in effect they're in a very vulnerable situation. They may themselves become victims, but I should say they may themselves sometimes also become perpetrators of the crime of trafficking as a negative survival strategy. Herein lies, from our perspective, a significant opportunity for impact to address some of the factors that are making these people most vulnerable, including effective implementation, as we heard again earlier on, implementation of the SDGs, implementation of the Global Compact on Migration, implementation of the Global Compact on Refugees. I should say there are also important links between the importance of ending statelessness and combating trafficking. Indeed, statelessness increases people's vulnerability to exploitation and abuse, including human trafficking. We would need, I think, to better explore the obvious potential linkages that exist between the impact of statelessness, knowing that when you're, in effect, I heard yesterday, statelessness is an exercise of a right. When you want to exercise your right to a nationality, it's an exercise of your right to exercise all your other rights. So if you can't exercise that original right, you actually can't exercise a whole range of other rights that come along with having a nationality. So that includes lack of access to education, to legal employment, to health, lack of documentation, fear from authorities as a result. And as such, it increases significantly the person's vulnerability to trafficking. So their linkages are logically very strong arms, and statelessness should therefore be a concern to anyone who is committed to fighting human trafficking. And in this context, I make a plug for the 2019 high-level event in order to combat statelessness and to end statelessness. There's a high-level event to enable us to make pledges in the international community to address this root cause and potentially concerns around trafficking. So overall, there's no doubt that we need to strengthen our research in order to have a better understanding with nuanced data in order to strengthen our efforts to combat trafficking, with strengthened and standardized indicators of trafficking for effective screening, identification, and referrals for the protection of victims. We have a hugely important journey ahead of us collectively, and for us I want to stress the word collectively, because it's work that needs to be done very much in partnership between states, international organizations, civil society, critical to working together for a future free of trafficking. We, from our side, will continue to support and engage with states, importantly also in the context of the follow-up to the global compacts, both of them, through a combination of outreach, information campaigns, identification, protection counseling, case management, referrals of those that need assistance and protection, as well as solutions. We'll continue to try to play our part with partners in order to combat this terrible scourge of human trafficking.
Thank you very much. I think you're underlining the problem of statelessness is particularly interesting because, as we know, the High Commissioner for Refugees has for many years now been calling on states to support his action to prevent statelessness from becoming a real problem to those concerned. And I'm not sure, I think there have been new states have acceded now to the convention, so that is good news on that front. Thank you very much for drawing our attention to that. I now have the pleasure of calling on Mrs. Kelly Ryan, who's next to me, who represents the Intergovernmental Consultations on Migration, Asylum and Refugees, IGC, and she will give us her perspective on human trafficking and on the action that her organization is taking in this field. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you to the Sovereign Order of Knights of Malta for the opportunity to speak today. As the coordinator of IGC, I work with 17 countries, 13 European and 4 non-European, to exchange information on migration and protection policies. And I'm speaking today in my personal capacity, though I have served as a former U.S. government official who has worked on counter-trafficking even before the development of the plenary protocols. The IGC played a small but important role in the development of the protocol. IGC assisted through informal meetings in clarifying the distinction of the definition of human smuggling and trafficking, as these terms were regularly used interchangeably in the 1990s. In 1999, we held formal meetings where the U.S. negotiator raised with IGC these key questions, and the IGC countries aligned their positions, including on the very important interpretive question of whether human trafficking does not, we took the position as to the protocol that human trafficking does not require the crossing of an international border, while human smuggling always required an element of benefit or financial gain for the smuggler. The good news today is that in the past 15 to 18 years since the protocols were adopted, much progress has been made in European countries to combat trafficking and to protect victims. Of course, more can and should be done. Today's panel seems to me an appropriate setting to discuss briefly what I believe to be one of the most important aspects of the march to end trafficking in persons, international cooperation. Trafficking often, though not always, involves the crossing of an international border, and so the need for cooperation between governments is essential in interdicting and arresting the traffickers, seizing assets and profits, protecting the victims, including by referral, rehabilitation, and compensation, breaking supply chains and protecting them from use of forced labor, exchanging law enforcement and intelligence leads, and learning from each other on best practices. National governments, of course, bear the primary responsibility to reduce the incidence of trafficking, but they can't do it alone. They must employ a whole-of-government approach to be most effective. They must work with the victims. the local and regional communities, other governments, and the private sector to make progress. Given the manifest need for cooperation, the topic was its own informal session leading up to the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration in Vienna. And prior to that, in an IGC session, our countries met to discuss what they could do. Noting that there's not one-size-fits-all approach, the UK official responsible for safeguarding in the United Kingdom discussed the UK draft model national response. It's built on 5 pillars and can be replicated throughout the world. Those pillars include political commitment, legislative framework, criminal justice access, victim support, community awareness and prevention, and business engagement. Very briefly, I want to offer a few ideas on some cooperation that could be enhanced. First, many countries have trafficking centers bringing together law enforcement, intelligence, and immigration officials. These centers could work together on trends analysis, travel routes, new or previously unknown trafficking patterns. A number of countries, such as Sweden and the Netherlands, also have special prosecutors on human trafficking that are trained to distinguish between cases of illegal employment, irregular migration, and human trafficking. And these experts could work with prosecutors less experienced in less experienced countries. There are many examples of European and international anti-trafficking initiatives, including the EU Anti-Trafficking Coordinator, a position that was adopted by the Commission, the OSCE's office, and post of Special Representative and Coordinator, the Greta Group, which has already been mentioned previously. Frontex has an anti-trafficking coordinator. Europol has a serious and organized crime business area, and the European Union and UNODC have launched global actions to prevent and address trafficking in persons and smuggling in 2016 in a 4-year plan. But let me turn more to some of the other ideas that might bear fruit. Second, more must be done to educate the citizens of our countries to identify trafficking and know how to partner with law enforcement to stop the activity and protect the victim. This is done already in many settings. For example, training flight attendants, emergency room doctors, nurses, truck drivers, etc. Third, training of UN officials and diplomats. Again, this was mentioned, but this is a small but important area. The U.S. has an innovative program to ensure that domestic workers hired by diplomats are not trafficked or exploited. This program seeks to ensure that the domestic workers retain their passports, control their hours and their bank accounts, and have recourse to help in the case of exploitation and trafficking. Fourth, partnering with civil and religious societies. Many creative ideas have been used to reach out to victims. Some such as simple as a book of matches with a hotline number inside the flag, or a poster in an asylum office in multiple languages urging trafficking persons to have called for help. In some circumstances, nuns, priests, imams, and monks will be the first trusted person the victim will turn to. They must know how they can help, how to protect themselves and the victim. They can also assist in the care of the victim and create a trusted environment. One amazing program I saw firsthand on a trip to Ulaanbaatar was where I met a one-woman NGO. She told me about her program she set up herself. She learned that many Mongolian girls earn small amounts of money while sex trafficked. This money is then relayed to their parents. When the daughters were able to get free and return home, their parents were trying to force them to go back in order to continue to receive the financial support. This NGO convinced the government of Mongolia to make deals with the parents. They found livelihoods for the parents only if their daughters stayed in school. This is an example of the power of one person who had no background in advocacy and what a profound success she's had in protecting the girls, these women of Mongolia. Fifth, there's a critical problem relating to the return of trafficking victims to their home countries, and also the need to cooperate to protect family members in third countries from reprisals. This is one of the most complicated areas I've seen. It requires inter- and intra-government cooperation. Getting it wrong can mean further violence to the victim and the family, and the traffickers walk free. Ensuring that the trafficking victim will be safe upon return is paramount. An excellent partnership during the 1990s after the breakup of the former Soviet Union was one in which the EU had a multiple twinning project with CIS countries to help them transfer the knowledge about victim protection and to ensure initial post-return monitoring. But experience demonstrates that people who have been smuggled can quickly become trafficked in order to pay off smuggling fees. This is a topic we could have spent the whole morning and day on. UNHCR has been doing some very important work in this regard, particularly for persons in a situation who are attempting to return home from Libya and other parts of Africa. This is a key area demonstrating the need for close cooperation, and UNHCR and IOM could partner with transit countries to better ensure prevention, prosecution, and protection. This is absolutely essential. I'd like to stop there and thank you very much for letting me address you on this important topic.
Thank you very much. I think that you drew our attention to very clearly to the problem of the return victims to their own countries. And that, of course, is also a worry, a deep concern of the UNHCR in repatriation questions. And then again, post-return monitoring is of course essential, because otherwise they will not be able to integrate back into their societies. So this is a big task also for all those concerned. And thank you for mentioning the importance of religious and faith-based communities, the role they play, because very often, as you mentioned, the imam, the priest, the rabbi are the persons that people who have been suffering turn to relieve their suffering and return for assistance, spiritual assistance, and also that can be very helpful in resilience building. So that is an important point, which the Order of Malta also very much is engaged in. Thank you very much. And now I have the pleasure of asking Mrs. Geneviève Collard from Caritas Internationalis to speak to us on the subject of Together Against Trafficking in Human Beings. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I am very happy to be here to represent the civil society. Caritas Internationalis strongly condemns all forms of slavery, forced labor, and human trafficking. Such practices of abuse are prevalent in context of crisis and weak governance. They are unacceptable and a crime against humanity wherever they happen. It is crucial that states increase their capacity to properly identify and substantially protect and assist victims. The main challenge now is the identification of cases of human trafficking among refugees and migrants. According to Caritas member organizations working in the field, due to the proliferation of conflicts which mainly affect civilians and which result in an unprecedented number of forcibly displaced people, human trafficking and exploitation seem to be on the rise. Therefore, more resources should be allocated to increase the identification of potential victims and referral capacities among a wide variety of frontline responders to migrants and refugees, such as social workers, doctors, police officers, religious people, and others. All stakeholders should put in place better protection systems for people at risk and provide assistance to survivors during and after emergencies. Emergency response programs, whether during the emergency phase or in support of exiled people, need to upscale their effort to address the risk of exploitation or detect at an early stage the presence of vulnerable groups, such as children, especially those without a family guardian, unaccompanied minors, women, and persecuted minorities. We have some research action about trafficking human beings in conflict and post-conflict situation, and you can see this document in a new website we opened today at the address www.outrelatraite.org. It's a website that we prepare with 26 NGOs in France to fight against trafficking human beings. Another point is that states should ensure to adapt their legislation in order to avoid and minimize the risk that people in a vulnerable situation become victims of trafficking. I would like to say a few words on the issue of organ trafficking. States who have in place a clear legislation on organ transportation with clear and transparent procedures and supervised by ethical committees in the hospitals are able to avoid trafficking in organs. Second point, the most urgent priority in this context is the provision of safe legal channels for refugees and all the people in the move, not only refugees. We need humanitarian corridors for all different types of people on the road, long-term and short-term, for protection and for economic reasons, temporary and permanent. This requires far more collaboration at both the bilateral and the multilateral levels. Border policies and immigration law must be oriented at protecting victims. It is also important that enterprise and companies carefully look at their supply chain to avoid risk of labor exploitation. We have to change urgently the global economic model and ensure decent work for all. International organizations, international companies have the possibility to assure that their products are free of any form of exploitation and human trafficking. In conclusion, there are a lot of possibilities to detect potential cases of human trafficking when there is an effective political will and strong national law in place. Trafficking human beings is an international underworld crime, so it should be addressed in this way. International collaboration and cooperation are therefore necessary. We find international institutions to help us to end trafficking human beings with a human rights approach. In each country, we must work on at international level. Thanks to the Order of Malta for the invitation and for the constant collaboration at local and international level.
Thank you very much, Madam. I think that the question of the organ trafficking is definitely also a great concern in many parts of the world. And with regard to the supply chains, it's, I think we've all noticed that many speakers have referred to this, whether it be IOM or the European Union, have referred to this quite clearly. So that is definitely a global challenge which we all need to engage in as well. Thank you very much. And the cooperation between Caritas and the Order of Malta is ongoing around the world, so that is good news. Yes. And now I turn to the organizer of this event, to our speaker, His Excellency Ambassador Michel Veuthey, who is now the main spokesman for the Order of Malta on the subject of combating human trafficking or trafficking in persons. And I would like at the outset to thank him very much indeed for the hard work he's already been doing over the last year since he was appointed to this very specific task, and also to thank you for having organized our event today. Michel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Thank you for your support and for the support of all the mission, be it CDRE or other members of the mission. And actually, yes, today the Order of Malta supports over 2,000 projects in more than 120 countries for those in need of medical, social, and humanitarian network, irrespective of religion, ethnicity, or nationality, based on the Order's principles. And indeed, this year is especially important. We commemorate both the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the abolition of slavery in the 19th century. And the Order of Malta would like to reaffirm its commitment to defend human life and dignity in all its forms, and to bring assistance to the poor, especially the most vulnerable people who are victims of contemporary forms of slavery. The Order aims at using the social services and humanitarian action of its national associations and its worldwide relief agency, Malteser International, to end modern slavery in the following ways. And I'm happy that some of them have already been mentioned, but still I think it's good to see that we need to be more creative in combating this plight of modern slavery. First, help everyday people identify their role in perpetuating modern slavery. Through programs aimed at raising awareness, helping people find their own role in the slavery chain, and thereby giving them the opportunity to reduce their own demand. Second, help prevent slavery by using our own existing field services to, again, raise awareness at the community level for safe movement options, expand efforts to promote the ethical handling of workers, and put the weight of the order behind efforts aimed at improving supply chain transparency and ethical consumption. Third, support and reintegrate slavery survivors with means and skills to live and stay out of a trafficked or irregular situation. We will increase our efforts to promote and deliver programs that aim to support the survivors' exit from their enslavement. This includes access to housing, to medical and psychosocial services, providing vocational skills, arranging job placements, and support that distances the survivor from their previous milieu. Fourth, promote better access to remedies and support for survivors by bringing together a broader range of costs and multi-sectoral partners in key areas. The Order can use its network and influence to provide more effective multi-partner solutions, for example, governments, international organizations, regional organizations. Banks and victims' organizations could work together to find new ways to monitor financial flows that highlight slavery and also identify alternative funding models for slavery victims' compensation. Fifth, bring demand for slaves into focus by promoting conscious consumption. Slave-free consumer-facing labels can be created for goods and services. As we have green labels, we should have red labels against slavery. Providing consumers a tangible role in cutting off demand and allowing markets to incentivize ethical behavior. Develop ethical business practices related to modern slavery, particularly in supply chains, and support efforts to expand the Nordic model to reduce demand for paid sexual services. Fifth, promote recognition of demand as the root cause of all forms of modern slavery by ensuring clarity around cause and vulnerability. That could be done by, first, globally promoting action aimed at causing demands for slaves of all types. Second, continuing to support actions to address leading vulnerabilities, such as extreme poverty and lack of local job alternatives. Comprehensive human development, starting with quality education in early childhood, creating subsequent opportunities for growth through employment, should be actively promoted. Third, promote safe migration, of course, in cooperation with IOM, in countries of origin, transit, and destination. Then support assistance and protection for refugees and asylum seekers, as you just mentioned, and also support efforts to prevent and settle conflicts. As previous speakers said, we cannot accomplish all of that without working together. And as Pope Francis said in May, this immense task, which requires courage, patience, and perseverance, demands a joint and global effort on the part of the different actors that make up society. That's why we would like to encourage everyone to work together against human trafficking in Europe and in the world, governments, international organizations, business, civil society, and of course beginning with faith-based organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You gave us some very good examples of how we should proceed So I won't, thank you very much. And I would like just to open the floor now for questions to the panelists, but we also have the pleasure of still having with us the Ambassador of Austria, President of the European Union. So if you have any questions on the European Union, I think Ambassador will be happy to reply as well. So the floor is open. Please, who would like to ask the first question? I don't see anybody at the moment. We've had an extremely rich and informative presentations and reports. Yes, please. Portugal, is that right? No? Okay. Please, madam, you have the floor.
I'm delegate I'm representative of our international congregation of the Shepherd Sisters. We are in 72 countries of the world, and I work with victims of trafficking for 25 years in Germany and Albania. And I really want to thank you, Mr. Veuthey, that you mentioned the Nordic model. And I wanted also to ask the panelists to give their stand. I missed it a little bit because it's all true what was said, that it is very complex, but if there's no demand for buying sex, then the numbers will sink. You know, they will look for another crime to do, let's say this. So I'm very happy that you mentioned it, and my question would be just, could you give your stand, because you can discuss it, you can say, okay, the numbers, they are going to the underground. So I would be happy if you have your stand or could explain a bit more about this Nordic model. Thank you.
Indeed. And you know, the Nordic model is actually not an innovative approach, but is something which is trying to undermine the demand for sexual so-called labor, but actually quite often sexual slavery, and unfortunately it's not widely accepted. And some countries think that sexual labor is a freedom not only of the women working in this domain, but also of the men paying for this. And unfortunately, it's a bit of the same story with some adoptions or even some organ trafficking. People believe that because you pay, then you have the right to access to services or goods, but that's exactly the merchandising, or that reducing human body or human parts of the body as goods to be bought and sold. And I think we should at times be protecting people against themselves. You know, for example, in the laws of war, you have a provision of the Geneva Conventions, of the Third Geneva Convention, prohibiting the prisoners of war to give up their right to be a prisoner of war. And I think it's, possibly it looks paradoxical, but it's good to protect people against themselves and to tell them you cannot sell your own dignity. We as international community, we as states, and we possibly as public conscience will protect you and will say you have a life, you have a human dignity, you have rights, and those rights do not only belong to you, but they belong to humankind. And that's why governments and us as public conscience, we have to protect people, and we have to protect human dignity and human life. And I think it's presently important while we are celebrating this Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? We still have 1 minute, I think. No? Yes, please, sir.
Master, I'm just curious to know if there are any public affairs officers of companies that have international supply chains present here right now.
Are
they? It's my question.
Yes, so you heard the question. Did everybody have the question? Anybody from public companies here? No, I don't see anybody. I'm afraid, although we did invite a number of persons from civil society, but as you know, it's not always easy on a work day to come to the Palais and to join our meetings. Any other questions? No, I don't see. Well, then I thank everybody for your participation, and please be free to speak to us afterwards if you wish. We are still here, and I wish you all a good afternoon and a safe trip back home for those of you who have come from far away. Thank you. Thank you, Mao. Thank you for having joined us.